The rain fell heavy over the South Boston streets that November night, turning the asphalt into black mirrors that reflected the neon signs of closed shops and the flickering streetlights that had seen better days. In this neighborhood, people learned early to keep their curtains drawn and their questions unasked. The kind of place where sirens were background music and where certain names were never spoken above a whisper. Lucia Ramos had lived in apartment 4B for 3 years now, ever since the divorce left her with nothing but debt, a 6-year-old daughter, and a determination that burned fiercer than any fear. She worked double shifts at the diner on Washington Street, her hands perpetually smelling of coffee and bacon grease, her feet aching in shoes she couldn't afford to replace. Every dollar was counted, every expense calculated. But mathematics had a cruel way of never adding up when you were already drowning. The loan had seemed like a lifeline 6 months ago. Her daughter Sophia needed surgery, a procedure the insurance refused to cover, and the hospital bills were piling up like snowdrifts in a blizzard. A co-worker had whispered a name, slipped her a phone number written on a napkin. Lucia knew what it meant. She knew the stories. But when your child is crying in pain and the medical system has turned its back, morality becomes a luxury you can't afford. The first few payments went fine. She met a man named Vincent in a coffee shop, handed over cash in a manila envelope, received a curt nod in return. Professional, clean, almost legitimate if you didn't look too closely at the violence lurking behind his eyes. But then her hours got cut at the diner. The new manager didn't like her accent, didn't like the way she stood up for the other immigrant workers. Suddenly she was working 4 shifts instead of 6, and the math that barely worked before became impossible. The phone calls started 3 weeks ago. Polite at first, then less so. Reminders became warnings. Warnings became threats. Lucia tried to explain, tried to negotiate, but the voice on the other end was as cold as the November wind rattling her windows. Then the call stopped entirely, and she knew that silence was far more dangerous than threats. Now, standing in her small living room, with its second-hand furniture and crayon drawings taped to the walls, Lucia understood that the debt had come to collect itself. The knock on the door at 10:30 p.m. wasn't a neighbor borrowing sugar. The weight of footsteps in the hallway, the way her doorknob turned despite being locked, the professional click of picked tumblers, these were the sounds of a world she'd hoped to never truly enter. 4 men entered her apartment. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times before. They didn't need to announce themselves, didn't need to explain why they were there. The lead man was younger than she expected, maybe 40, with expensive shoes that clicked on her cheap linoleum, and a watch that cost more than her annual rent. Behind him came the muscle, 2 broad-shouldered men who flanked the doorway like bookends of violence. But it was the 4th man who made Lucia's blood turn to ice water in her veins. Don Matteo Romano didn't look like a monster. That was perhaps the most terrifying thing about him. He was 52 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair, and a face that belonged on a businessman or a university professor. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, and his hands were clean and manicured. But Lucia had heard the stories, whispered in Spanish between her co-workers at the diner, stories of entire rival operations dismantled overnight, of men who crossed him found in the harbor with concrete blocks tied to their feet, of a coldness in his eyes that spoke of a soul that had long ago traded mercy for power. He stood in the center of her living room, seeming to fill the space despite his average height. His gaze swept across the apartment, taking in the worn couch, the small television, the plastic toys scattered near the wall, the framed photograph of Sophia's first day of school. He noted everything with the assessment of a man who understood that details mattered, that a person's environment told a story more honest than their words ever could. Matteo's hand moved to his jacket, and Lucia's heart stopped. She knew what was coming. She'd heard how these things ended. The gun emerged, black and heavy and absolutely final. He didn't point it at her immediately. He simply held it, let its presence fill the room like a sixth person, let the weight of what it represented settle into every corner. Lucia didn't beg. Pride mixed with terror in her chest, keeping her spine straight even as her hands trembled. She thought of Sophia asleep in the bedroom, of the life her daughter deserved, of all the dreams that were about to be erased, because she'd tried to save her child and failed to pay the price. She stepped backward, not in retreat, but in positioning, placing herself between the gun and the hallway that led to the bedroom where her daughter slept. That's when Matteo raised the weapon, not in haste, not in anger, but with the calm deliberation of a man who had done this before and would likely do it again. His finger rested along the trigger guard, his face expressionless, his breathing steady. This was business. This was the cost of operating in his world. This was the message that had to be sent to everyone else who might think debts to Don Matteo Romano were optional. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. The rain against the windows seemed to fade away. Time stretched like taffy, each second expanding into an eternity. Lucia closed her eyes, said a silent prayer in Spanish, the words her grandmother had taught her as a child. She hoped it would be quick. She hoped Sophia wouldn't wake up. She hoped someone kind would take care of her daughter after. Then, from the shadows of the hallway, a small voice shattered the moment like a stone through glass. The little girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She stood in the doorway of the hallway, barefoot on the cold floor, wearing pajamas decorated with cartoon rabbits. Her dark hair was tangled from sleep, her eyes huge and brown and filled with a terror that came from understanding just enough to be afraid, but not enough to hide. In her arms, she clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, one ear partially torn, fur matted from years of being loved too hard. Sofia Ramos hadn't meant to wake up. She'd been dreaming of school, of her friend Emma who shared crayons with her, of the way her mother smiled when she brought home drawings to pin on the refrigerator. But something had pulled her from sleep. Not a sound exactly, but the feeling of wrongness that children sense instinctively, the way animals know before an earthquake that the ground is about to betray them. She crept to the doorway, confused and frightened, and seen her mother standing in the living room with strangers, seen the way her mother's body was rigid with fear, seen the men who looked like they belonged in the scary movies she wasn't allowed to watch, and seen the gun in the well-dressed man's hand, pointing at the person Sophia loved most in the world. The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the terrible silence of that moment they rang out like a bell in an empty cathedral. "Please, don't hurt my mum." The effect was instantaneous and profound. Matteo Romano, a man who had ordered executions over dinner, who had personally eliminated rivals without losing sleep, who had built an empire on calculated violence and strategic ruthlessness, froze completely. The gun remained raised, but his finger slipped from the trigger guard. His jaw tightened, muscles working beneath his skin. His eyes, which had been as cold and empty as winter ice, suddenly filled with something that looked almost like pain. The little girl took a step forward, and every man in the room tensed, but she wasn't moving toward Matteo. She was moving toward her mother, her small feet padding across the floor, her stuffed rabbit dragging behind her. When she reached Lucia, she wrapped her free arm around her mother's legs and buried her face against her hip, still clutching the toy with desperate strength. Matteo's hand began to shake. It was barely noticeable at first, just a slight tremor in his fingers, but it spread through his wrist, his forearm, until his entire arm was trembling. The gun wavered, dipped, rose again. He tried to steady it, to return to the cold professionalism that had defined his life for decades, but something inside him had cracked like ice under sudden weight. The other men in the room watched in stunned silence. Vincent, who had handled the initial loan, had never seen the boss show uncertainty. The two enforcers had witnessed Matteo execute men, begging for their lives without hesitation. But now, faced with a small girl clutching a toy rabbit and whispering a plea, the most feared man in Boston seemed to be coming apart. Memories crashed through Matteo's mind like a dam breaking. Another woman, another time, Isabella Romano, with her black hair and fierce spirit, laughing in their kitchen in the North End, flour on her nose from making pasta, the way she'd challenged him even when he was building his empire, the way she demanded he be better, do better. Remember that power without principle was just tyranny in expensive suits, and their daughter, Maria, born with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn determination, 7 years old, obsessed with ballet, always twirling through their house like a tiny tornado of joy and energy. He'd kept his business separate from his family, built walls between his two worlds, convinced himself that he could be both a loving father and a ruthless criminal, that the violence he dealt in would never touch the people he loved. He'd been wrong. The rival family hadn't cared about his walls, about his attempts to compartmentalize his life. They'd proven a point, sent a message, shown him that no one was untouchable. The car bomb had been meant for him, but he'd been running late that morning. Isabella had been driving Maria to ballet class. The explosion had been heard across 3 neighborhoods. Matteo had arrived at the scene to find his car a twisted skeleton of metal, flames still licking at the wreckage, emergency responders trying to keep him back. He'd fallen to his knees on the pavement, his expensive suit soaking up oil and water, and something inside him had died alongside them. He'd become colder after that, harder, more ruthless. He'd eliminated the rival family within a week, personally ensuring that every member suffered before they died. But the revenge had felt hollow because it didn't bring them back. That had been 8 years ago. 8 years of building walls around the wound, of pretending the scar tissue was the same as healing. 8 years of telling himself he felt nothing, that emotion was weakness, that the man who had loved Isabella and Maria Romano was dead along with them. But now, looking at this little girl with her worn, stuffed rabbit and her terrified eyes, Matteo saw Maria, saw his daughter at 6 years old before she ever started ballet, when she still carried around a stuffed elephant everywhere, saw the innocence that he'd failed to protect, saw the childhood that had been stolen by the very world he'd chosen to inhabit. The gun lowered slowly, almost involuntarily, until it pointed at the floor. Matteo's breathing had become ragged, his composure shattering like a mirror struck by a hammer. He looked at Lucia, really looked at her, and saw not a debtor or a target, but a mother trying to survive, trying to protect her child, trapped in the same brutal machinery that had destroyed his own family. When he spoke, his voice was rough, barely controlled, carrying the weight of years of suppressed grief. "Who told you I'd hurt her?" The question hung in the air, not really directed at anyone, certainly not expecting an answer from a 6-year-old girl. It was the question of a man trying to understand how he'd become the monster standing in a stranger's living room, gun in hand, about to destroy another family. Sophia didn't answer with words. She simply held her mother tighter, her small face pressed against Lucia's side, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The stuffed rabbit's remaining good ear drooped forward, as if the toy itself was too sad to stay upright. Matteo turned toward his men, his movements stiff and mechanical, like a machine shutting down. His face had transformed from its earlier professional coldness into something raw and haunted. "Leave," he said, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. "All of you." Vincent stepped forward, confused and concerned. In all his years working for Don Romano, he'd never seen the boss like this, never seen him show weakness or mercy. "Boss, the debt?" I said leave. The words came out sharper now, edged with something dangerous that wasn't directed at Lucia or her daughter, but at anyone who might question what was happening. "Get out! Now!" The men hesitated, exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with abandoning their boss in an unsecured location, with a job unfinished. But the look in Matteo's eyes brooked no argument. They filed out one by one, their footsteps heavy on the stairs, the sound fading into the rain-soaked night. The door clicked shut, leaving Matteo alone with Lucia and Sofia in the small apartment. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension, no longer the quiet before violence, but the hollow emptiness after a storm passes, when the world is trying to remember how to be normal again. Matteo looked down at the gun still in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. It suddenly seemed obscene, this instrument of death, in a room with crayon drawings and children's toys. He moved slowly, deliberately, engaging the safety and tucking it back into his shoulder holster beneath his jacket. The action seemed to take enormous effort, as if the weapon had grown impossibly heavy. Lucia remained frozen, her daughter still clinging to her, unsure whether to feel relief or fear at this unexpected turn. In her experience, powerful men didn't change their minds. They didn't show mercy. And they certainly didn't send their own men away when business was unfinished. This deviation from expectation made her almost more frightened than the gun had. Matteo walked slowly to the worn couch and sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support him. He rested his elbows on his knees and ran his hands through his hair, disheveling the carefully maintained appearance. For a long moment, he just sat there, breathing, existing, wrestling with something internal and invisible. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of authority, almost conversational. "How old is she?" Lucia's voice was tentative, testing whether it was safe to respond. 6. She turned 6 in August. A sound escaped Matteo's throat, something between a laugh and a sob, though he caught it quickly. "My daughter was 7 when she died. Car bomb meant for me, 8 years ago this December." He said it matter-of-factly, as if reporting weather, but his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The confession hung in the air between them. Lucia didn't know what to say, didn't know if sympathy was appropriate or safe. She kept her hand on Sofia's head, gently stroking her daughter's hair, trying to calm the trembling she could feel through the small body. Matteo looked up at them, his eyes red-rimmed but dry, as if he'd exhausted his capacity for tears years ago. "I told myself I'd gotten past it. Told myself I'd moved on, become stronger, become the man who couldn't be hurt anymore because he didn't let himself feel anything." He gestured vaguely around the apartment. "And then I walk in here, ready to do business as usual. Send the message I've sent 100 times before. And your daughter—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Sofia had turned her head slightly, peeking at this strange man who had terrified her, but was now sitting on their couch looking more broken than dangerous. Her child's instincts, which had warned her of danger minutes ago, were now picking up something else, sadness so deep it seemed to fill the room. Matteo stood abruptly, as if sitting had become unbearable. He walked to the window, looking out at the rain-streaked glass and the sodium-lit streets beyond. "The debt," he said, his back to them. "How much surgery did your daughter need?" "A kidney condition," Lucia answered, still cautious. "The doctors caught it early, but the procedure wasn't covered by insurance. $42,000. I borrowed 15 from you, from your people. The rest I managed through payment plans with the hospital." "And she's healthy now?" "Yes, completely recovered." Matteo nodded slowly, his reflection in the rain-spotted window showing a man having a conversation with himself as much as with Lucia. "I built this empire on fear, on the principle that debts must be paid, that weakness cannot be tolerated, that mercy is a luxury that criminals can't afford. I convinced myself that this was strength, that this was survival. He touched the glass with his fingertips, watching the rain rivulets distort his reflection. But I was lying to myself. I wasn't being strong. I was being dead. I died 8 years ago, along with my wife and daughter. I just forgot to stop breathing. He turned back to face them, his expression complex and unreadable. From now on, your debt is paid, fully. I'll have documentation drawn up showing you paid everything, interest included. No one will come after you. No one will even remember you owed anything. Lucia felt tears burning in her eyes, but she didn't dare let relief take over completely. Why? Why are you doing this? Matteo's smile was sad and broken. Because your daughter reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten. She reminded me what it feels like to want to protect something innocent, to see something worth preserving in this ugly world. He looked at Sophia, who was watching him with wide eyes. Raise her far from this world, Lucia. Don't let her ever know what kind of men walk these streets. Don't let her become someone who has to borrow from people like me. He walked toward the door, moving like a man twice his age, exhausted by more than physical exertion. But halfway there, he paused and turned back. I had this idea, you see, after Isabella and Maria died. I thought if I made myself harder, if I stopped feeling, then nothing could hurt me again. I was right about that. Nothing could hurt me, but nothing could make me human again either. I don't understand, Lucia whispered. Tonight, when your daughter asked me not to hurt you, it hurt me. For the first time in 8 years, something got through, and I realized that being able to feel pain means being able to feel anything at all, means being alive instead of being a ghost in an expensive suit. He reached into his jacket, and Lucia tensed instinctively, but he pulled out only a business card, which he placed on the small table by the door. If anyone bothers you, if any of my organization or any other tries to collect from you or threatens you, you call that number. You tell them Don Romano said you're under protection. They'll understand. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just promise me one thing. He looked directly at Sophia, who met his gaze with the fearless curiosity of a child who had decided this sad man wasn't scary anymore. Promise me you'll let her have the childhood I couldn't give my daughter, the normal life, the safe life, the one where men like me stay in the shadows where we belong. I promise, Lucia said, meaning it completely. Matteo nodded once, final and decisive. Then he opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Lucia heard his footsteps descending the stairs, slower than when he'd arrived. Heavier somehow despite carrying less intention. Outside, the rain had intensified, turning from steady downpour to torrential sheets that reduced visibility to a few feet. The streetlights created cones of orange illumination that the rain seemed to devour, and the gutters ran with water that carried the city's debris towards storm drains that gurgled and choked. Matteo's driver and men waited by the black SUV, huddled under an awning, smoking cigarettes and speaking in low voices. They straightened when they saw him emerge from the building, their faces showing confusion, concern, and a wariness that came from not understanding what had happened upstairs. Vincent stepped forward, flicking his cigarette into the rushing water. "Boss, is it handled?" Matteo walked past them without responding, continuing down the sidewalk away from the vehicle. The rain soaked through his expensive suit within seconds, plastering his hair to his scalp, running down his face. He made no effort to shield himself, seeming not to notice or care. "Boss!" Vincent called after him, exchanging alarmed glances with the other men. "Where are you going?" Matteo kept walking, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched not against the weather, but against something internal. His mind was full of images: Isabella's laugh, Maria's ballet recital, the twisted metal of the car bomb, Lucia shielding her daughter, Sophia's wide, frightened eyes, the stuffed rabbit's drooping ear. 8 years of memories he'd tried to bury came flooding back, no longer dulled by the armor of deliberate coldness. The men followed at a distance, uncertain and worried. In their world, this kind of behavior meant breakdown, vulnerability, weakness that enemies would exploit. They'd seen bosses lose their edge before, seen how quickly the vultures circled when they sensed blood in the water. But something in Matteo's bearing kept them from approaching too closely. He wasn't walking like a man falling apart. He was walking like a man who had finally made a decision after years of uncertainty, like someone who had found the answer to a question they'd been avoiding. He walked for blocks through the South Boston streets, past bodegas with barred windows and row houses with lights burning behind curtains, past the corner where a homeless man huddled in a doorway, past the church with its stone steps slick with rain, past the elementary school with its empty playground and chain-link fence, the city at night, honest and ugly and real. Eventually, Matteo found himself at the harbor, standing on a pier that extended into the black water. The rain fell harder here, pushed by wind off the ocean, cold and merciless. The lights of the city reflected on the choppy water, fragmented and distorted. This was where they'd found some of his enemies over the years, weighted down, erased. This was where he'd stood years ago after the funerals, staring at the water and wondering if it might be easier to walk in and not come back. He pulled the gun from his holster, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. This weapon had taken 7 lives personally, more by proxy. It was an extension of the man he'd become after the car bomb, the tool of his transformation from husband and father into executioner and crime lord. He looked at it in the dim light, rain beading on its metal surface. Then, in a motion both sudden and deliberate, he hurled it into the harbor. It made a small splash, barely audible above the rain, and disappeared into the dark water. Matteo stood there watching the ripples fade, feeling as if he'd thrown away more than just a weapon. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Saw messages from his lieutenants asking about the situation, about orders, about business that needed attending. He looked at the screen for a long moment, rain running down his face, then dropped the phone into the water as well. It vanished without ceremony, taking with it 8 years of contacts, operations, and the infrastructure of his criminal life. Vincent and the men had caught up, standing back on the pier watching this incomprehensible behavior. "Boss, what are you doing?" Vincent's voice carried genuine fear now. "Talk to us. What happened up there?" Matteo turned to face them, and they saw something in his expression that none of them had ever seen before. Not weakness exactly, but humanity. "I remembered what it feels like to be ashamed of myself," he said simply. "I remembered what it feels like to look at a child and want to be someone better than what I am." "We can handle it differently," Vincent said quickly, misunderstanding. "The woman, we don't have to." "The woman and her daughter are under my personal protection. Full protection, Vincent. Anyone touches them, anyone threatens them, anyone even looks at them wrong, they answer to me. Spread the word through the organization." "Of course, boss, whatever you say. And spread one more thing." Matteo looked at each of his men in turn, his voice steady despite the rain, despite the cold, despite the enormity of what he was about to say. "Effective immediately, I'm stepping back from operations. Vincent, you'll take over day-to-day management. The family businesses, legitimate and otherwise, will be restructured. We're going straight, or as straight as we can manage. The violence stops. The intimidation stops. We become what we should have been all along, businessmen, not monsters." The men stared at him in shocked silence. Vincent found his voice first. "Boss, you can't be serious. The other families, they'll see this as weakness. They'll move against us. Let them try. I've had enough of the violence, Vincent. I've had enough of being the thing mothers warn their children about. I've had enough of looking in the mirror and seeing a man my wife wouldn't recognize and my daughter would be afraid of." Matteo's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. I can't bring them back. I can't undo the things I've done. But maybe I can stop adding to the body count. Maybe I can try to be someone who deserves to remember them without shame. He started walking again, away from the pier, back toward the streets. The men followed uncertainly, no longer sure if they were protecting their boss or witnessing his collapse. But Matteo didn't collapse. He walked with purpose now, even as his expensive Italian leather shoes squelched with water, even as his suit hung heavy and soaked, even as he shivered from cold that went bone deep. Some of the organization would call it a breakdown. The streets would whisper that Don Romano had gone soft, that a woman and child had broken the unbreakable man. Rivals would test the boundaries, looking for weakness to exploit. Some of his own people would leave, unable to follow a boss who chose mercy over fear. Let them, Matteo thought. Let them say what they wanted. Let the empire he'd built crack and crumble, if that's what happened. Because tonight, for the first time in 8 years, he'd felt something other than the cold emptiness that had defined him. Tonight, he'd looked into a little girl's eyes and seen his daughter. Tonight, he'd been given a chance to be something other than the monster, and he'd taken it. As he walked through the rain-soaked streets of Boston, Matteo Romano began to cry. Not the silent, dignified tears of a man trying to maintain composure, but the raw, gasping sobs of someone who had finally allowed themselves to grieve. He cried for Isabella and Maria, for the 8 years he'd spent as a ghost, for all the lives he'd taken and ruined, for the man he'd become and the man he used to be. And somewhere in the distance, lightning split the sky, thunder rolling across the city like a pronouncement from above. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets, washing the blood from the pavement, washing a man who had finally remembered how to feel. In her apartment, Lucia held her daughter close, the business card on the table representing both a lifeline and a mystery she'd never fully understand. Sophia had already fallen back asleep, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight, her dreams returning to normal things like school and friends and the simple joys of being 6 years old and safe. The city turned, the night passed, and somewhere in the darkness, the most feared man in Boston kept walking, kept crying, kept moving towards something that might, just might, be redemption. If this story moved you, if it made you think about mercy, forgiveness, and the power of innocence to transform even the hardest hearts, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you stories of humanity in its rawest form, tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, of choices that define us, and of moments that change everything. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to join us for more powerful narratives that remind us what it means to be human. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose to feel again.